Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, journalist and author John Lorinc brings us the story of his family's flight from Hungary to Canada, and in doing so, recaptures his Jewish identity. Then we'll speak to a representative of Journey Home Hospice about providing palliative care to the homeless. That's next on the agenda. In 1956, some 36,000 Hungarians emigrated to Canada, fleeing the Soviet invasion of their country. Journalist John Lorinc's parents were among them. In his new memoir, No Jews Live Here, he mines the stories he heard growing up to document 4 generations of his Hungarian Jewish family's journey through the Holocaust, the 56th Revolution, and ultimate settlement in Toronto. And John Lorinc joins us now here in studio. Great to have you back here.
Yeah, thanks very much.
You did a nice job on this book, John. Well done.
I appreciate it.
Congratulations. I want to know what prompted you to start looking into the facts behind the stories that your parents told you about their background.
Well, I grew up with all these stories, right? They were just around me, and I became increasingly sort of concerned that I wouldn't be able to, when my mother dies, that I've lost them. So during the pandemic, I ended up going up to visit her at her retirement home. Couldn't go inside, so we would sit on a park bench or on the terrace behind, and I just put my tape recorder down and started just recording her stories. And then I realized from some discussions with friends that it would make sense to kind of try to expand on this, and it also dovetailed with like a long-standing desire to write something about my grandmother, who was a character.
She's the star of the story, no question about it. We'll get to her in a second,
Yeah.
but how do you fact-check your mother?
Well, so I had, so this is a good question, and so I interviewed her extensively about 30 years ago for a story that I'd been assigned to do by Saturday night that didn't end up being published, but I kept all my research notes. And so what I tried to do was check one set of interviews against the other, the more recent interviews that I did a couple of years ago, and then triangulate with information that I could find about actual events that occurred, and that's the way I sort of went about trying to corroborate, details. There are some things you can't corroborate, and that's the nature of the form, the memoir. But I tried to corroborate as much as I could.
Your last name is Lorinc, spelled Lorinc.
Yeah.
That was not your family name overseas.
No.
What was it back then?
So my father's name was Lustig, which is a German name, like a lot of Eastern European Jews had German names. In German, it means happy. In Hungarian, it has a sort of pejorative connotation, lazy. And he didn't like that name. And after the war, he changed it to Lorinc. My mother doesn't know why he chose Lorinc. I don't know why he chose Lorinc. It's an incredibly obscure name.
Well, let me add another question to the to the wise about this. How many people have mispronounced your name over the years?
Countless.
Well, you got to admit,
Yeah.
it's a tough one.
It's a tough one, and most people will never meet another one that's not related to me.
Exactly. The timing of this book, why is that important to you?
So the timing is an important question for all the obvious reasons. I didn't write this book to make any comment about what's going on in the Middle East. I started working on it, before October 7th, but I was writing it, when that attack came on October 7th, and then the subsequent invasion of Gaza, and it really, it sort of, really made me pay attention to the content a lot more intensely. As I mentioned to your producer, I ended up writing one of the chapters about 1944, which was the worst time in Hungary, during the week of October 7th, which is not an experience I want to do twice. It was was a pretty intense week, and it was a pretty intense subject matter to be writing about. And I think that these stories are worth telling and remembering for various reasons. We could talk about those, but one of them is that they're in the case of the Hungarian Jews, they went from a very kind of settled, cosmopolitan, peaceful, integrated life to horrors in the course of a decade, and that's a thing that it's important to sit with and to remember that societies can turn like that.
As long as I have known you, and I've known you a couple of decades anyway, maybe more, you are a pretty straight-ahead, unemotional guy.
Yeah.
So now you're talking about writing about the worst chapter of your family's history at a time 14 months ago when Israelis are suffering their worst post-Holocaust trauma.
Right.
Did you have any personal difficulty getting through all that?
Well, I think my honest answer would be that in regards to the material of the book, the subject matter, not terribly much, because a lot of this, these stories I knew. What I did manage to discover during the course of the research is what happened to my father's father, who disappeared without a trace and was never heard from again. And, when I figured out what happened to him, using some document searches and so on, that was kind of cathartic, and I was glad to be able to put that in the book and kind of memorialize him that way. It's also, everything that's gone on in Israel has been incredibly intense, right? Both the pogrom that happened on October 7th and then this terrible, attack on the Palestinian people that's caused so much suffering and devastation. And, it's hard not to think about the two things at the same time. And I think it was important to think about the two things at the same time. These stories and the stories of the people who are living in those kibbutzim in the south of Israel and the people who are living in Palestine and are enduring terrible trauma.
It's untold misery.
Yeah.
All of it. All right, let's circle back to your maternal grandmother. This is Ilona. Sheldon, if you wouldn't mind, put a picture up of her. There she is. Okay, tell us about her.
Ilona, my mother's mother, was a person that I saw a lot of when we were growing up. She came over for dinner every Sunday. She was one of the major inspirations for this book. The working title of this book was called Best Appreciated from Afar, and this was really her. She was a big personality. She loved gossip. She went to the horse races. She was always decked out in costume jewelry, and she wore high heels to her dying day, so much so that her feet were kind of malformed because of it. And she began her life in the lap of luxury. Her parents were affluent business people. She was sent to school in Switzerland. She had nannies. She had no expectations around her life. And then, things started going bad in Hungary in the late 1930s. And quite unexpectedly, she was able to access this kind of resilience and resourcefulness that enabled her to protect, almost all of her family during these terrible moments that happened in the 1944 from March to, basically March 1944 to early 1945. And then she had to survive with two young children after the war and all the devastation, then came to Canada, reinvented herself as a seamstress, lived in Montreal, came to Toronto, did it all over again. So she was an incredible survivor. At the same time, she was kind of an anti-Semite.
I was just going to ask you about this. This is a Jewish woman who kind of didn't like Jews.
Right. And so her parents had converted in the 1920s, and she regarded being Jewish in Hungary as being a social liability. And so she used to say to my mother that the day that her parents converted was the best day of her life.
Converted away from Judaism.
Converted away from Judaism. And so, there's a lot of that kind of self-hatred, self-loathing, social opportunism in Hungary at that time.
Which sort of makes me understand why, and yet I still need to hear an explanation from you about the moment in your childhood, and I think you were maybe 10, when your father came to you and said, John, you're Jewish, but don't tell anybody.
Right.
What did you make of that as a 10-year-old?
So I remember it very vividly. I remember where we were in the neighborhood where I grew up, which was in Lawrence Park. I remember asking my father how people could tell the difference between Jews and non-Jews, if everybody dressed the same. I didn't find it to be a shocking sort of revelation, but he said, it's a secret, don't tell anybody. And so I didn't tell anybody for a long time. And one of the things that I came to learn over the years is that this is an experience that many Hungarian Jews have had, including my generation, people who were born here, who had that experience, and certainly in my mother's, my parents' generation, and then the generations between. And one of the things I wanted to do with this book is to kind of unpack why that was, right?
Because you didn't grow up in Nazi-dominated Eastern Europe.
No,
you grew up in Toronto.
In Toronto. And, after a number of years, I realized that, pogroms were not very common in North Toronto in the 1970s. And so I thought, okay, well, I don't need to keep that secret because I'm not in danger. But nevertheless, my parents and most of their friends were very adamant about just leaving all of that behind. That was a European thing. It caused them nothing but trouble, produced yellow stars and hardship, death. When they came to Canada, it was like, that's over. We're going to be Canadians. We're not going to be religious in any way.
But did it put something in your head?
Yes, of course.
Suggesting that there's something wrong with being Jewish?
It didn't put in my head that there was something wrong with it, but that there was a big question mark associated with it. Why was this a secret that I needed to keep? What was the content of that need for secrecy? And consequently, I became very interested in the Holocaust and in the Second World War, and then later in Hungarian Jewish culture. But that was sort of the pebble in the pond, ironically, right? Because the whole intent was to, here's a piece of information, but you don't need to do anything with it except not tell anybody.
And it's kind of taken over your life, in fact.
Well, it's taken over part of my life.
Part of your life, yeah, for sure. Did you, as you got older, did you ever revisit that conversation with your dad?
With him?
Yeah.
No, because so I was 12.
I know you were young when he died.
Yeah, and so it didn't come up because I was 10 when he told me, and, then he was gone.
Okay. Let's talk about, and Sheldon, I'm on the bottom of page 2 here. Can we get that photo of Ilona and Paul up? This is their wedding. These are your maternal grandparents. What happened to them during the war?
So during the war, my grandfather, whose name was Paul, who was he ran a farm in the south of Hungary. He, like everybody else, lost everything, right? So systematically, all of their possessions were taken away from them. They couldn't run the farm, and he ended up in a forced labor unit in 1944. And my grandmother was sort of on her own to try to figure out how to protect her kids, my mother and my uncle, and they were in hiding for a while. They had to buy, fake IDs. And in the most intense period of the war, which was December of 1945, and there was, the Soviet troops were surrounding Budapest, and there was a terrible siege of Budapest. They kind of went into hiding, posing as Romanian refugees, and ended up hiding in the basement of a building, which was, where there were a whole platoon of German soldiers were camped out in the courtyard of this building. And, at the height of the siege, there was all this intense artillery and bombing out on the street, and they were in the basement, and a man came down to the basement and said, all the able-bodied men have to come up to the street and help pull in the, wounded German soldiers. And immediately my grandfather was struck by shrapnel and basically bled to death in the next couple hours. After that, my grandmother, this woman who had, been born into the lap of luxury, was a widow, and she had to, make do for herself, and she did, and that was, a remarkable thing, and not unique to her, I have to stress, right, that so many people had to survive, had to find resilience within themselves in different ways, and so she was one of those people.
That's your mother's parents. What about your father's parents? We have a picture of them too. Sheldon, you want to bring that up? This is Joska and Clara, your paternal grandparents.
Yeah.
What's their story during the war?
So their story is a little bit more elusive because for part of 1944, my father was in a forced labor camp in Yugoslavia, and they only had, he was an only child. So while he was away, it's not clear what happened to them. I don't know if they were in hiding. I don't know, what their specific circumstances. But in early November of 1944, Joshka, that's sort of a short form for Joseph, was taken away. And I always grew up knowing that he had just disappeared and didn't know what happened to him. And I've done some searches and found little clues. And while I was working on the book, I found a bigger clue about when exactly he was taken away. And then I cross-referenced what else was happening in Hungary at that time. And there was a death march that was ordered by Eichmann, to get about 50 or 60,000 Hungarian Jews to the Austrian-Hungarian border to dig tank traps. And I believe he probably died on that death march.
Here is from your book. We're going to do an excerpt here. Sheldon, I'm at the middle of page 3. This is your father, who didn't say much about his time in that Serbian copper mine. But here's the quote from the book. Like countless others who endured trauma during the Holocaust and war in general, my father did not relate his experiences, and I was too young to understand why. There is the obvious answer. The listener, me, lacked the maturity and the context to deal with the harshness of his experiences. Yet, the ubiquity of heavy silences that define the lives of so many survivors and veterans, as well as perpetrators and bystanders, suggests something else, a kind of psychological or psychic outer limit, beyond which the conventional tools of memory and storytelling vanish into a black hole. Did you eventually find out enough to satisfy your curiosity about the conditions your father existed in that copper camp?
Almost. So I knew some stories. There was a particular type of torture that they used at that camp. I knew that he had this aversion to onions because, they had so little food that they had to forage for wild onions in the forests around this camp, and he just loathed the taste of that. So he never wanted to have onions in anything that my mother made. And then while I was doing the research for this book, and even a little bit before I started writing it, I came across a memoir that had been translated about a guy who had been in this exact same forced labor camp, which was this copper mine in eastern Yugoslavia. And reading his memoir was really a very gripping experience for me because he told the story of what had happened to the guys who survived this copper mine. And so he was telling a story that my father would have seen, and it was that was a cathartic experience to read that memoir, and it was one of the motivations for me for writing this book.
We're going to do another excerpt from the book. This is about the devastation of the Holocaust on the Jewish community in Hungary. And here's what you write. The ultimate impact of the Holocaust in Hungary was horrific. During the Second World War, 618,000 Hungarian Jews were killed or deported by Hungarian and Nazi officials, soldiers, and police officers. To put that staggering number into sharper context, as of 1941, when Hungary entered the conflict, the country's Jewish population stood at just over 825,000, meaning 3 in 4 perished. In Budapest, just over half the city's pre-war Jewish population survived. Approximately 119,000 Budapest Jews were liberated in early 1945, while 105,453 died or were killed by the Nazis, the Hungarian Gendarmerie, and the Arrow Cross, basically the fascists of Hungary. We know a lot about the effects of the Holocaust on German Jews, on Polish Jews, a lot less about the impact on Hungarian Jews. How come?
Well, I would say that there are a number of reasons. One, it's very important, and I really tried to get at this in the book, to understand the timing. So the worst parts of the Holocaust in Hungary were in the spring of 1944 and in the fall of 1944. And if you think about what else is going on in the Second World War at the time, at exactly the moment when trains full of Hungarian Jews, primarily from the rural areas, were going to Auschwitz, the Allies had landed in the beaches of Normandy and were basically liberating France and the Low Countries, and then, and the Americans were pushing up through Italy, and the Soviets were coming in through Eastern Europe. And so there was this kind of weird split screen where, history recalls that at that point, the Germans were really back on their heels. But in Hungary, because Hungary had remained sort of nominally independent, it wasn't invaded like Austria or Czechoslovakia, they hadn't gotten into heavy deportations until 1944, until March of 1944. And so it's this last gasp of what happened and the final solution. And the other, I think, important detail is that the way the Germans and the Hungarian fascists sort of managed that deportation is they began in the rural areas, and the rural areas were primarily Orthodox, right? So the religious communities, small religious communities in Hungary were wiped off the face of the map. Whereas in Budapest, the Budapest Jews were very assimilated, and many of them were converted, or they had nothing to do with the traditional Jewish institutions. And then after the war, if they survived, a lot of them just went like, enough, it's no more. And so those stories were much more muted, I think, than the stories of the survivors from other parts of Europe and Central Europe.
I read a word in your book I hadn't seen before. Judapest. They called Budapest Judapest because there were so many Jewish people there. Okay. Your parents, Sheldon, top of page 5. Let's get that picture of John's parents up there. How did your parents meet and marry? There they are.
So this is a funny story. So after the war, my mother was looking for a job as a secretary and ended up following up a job posting at the Department of Pathology at the medical school in Budapest. And my father at that point was a pathologist. He was a young physician. They were both in their 20s. And so my mother showed up to apply for this job, and she saw this guy who was standing there in a white medical coat, and he didn't have a shirt on for some reason. And he said to her, he introduced himself, and he said to her, "Do you want to see an autopsy?" And my mother said, "No, I don't think so."
That's an interesting pickup line.
It's an epic pickup line. And then, but my father, didn't take no for an answer, and he asked again. And then, my mother sort of looked at him and she said, "Okay, he's a good-looking guy." And so she, so she went with him and watched this autopsy. And so she, her joke, which she likes to tell, she told it to me again yesterday when I was visiting her, is that she met, my father over a dead body.
And that's accurate, isn't it?
It's absolutely accurate.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay. Let's take our remaining moments here and talk about Hungary post-World War II. We're now 1956, and a lot of Hungarians had to make, they made decisions that a lot of them had not made during World War II.
Right.
In the war, a lot of them stayed too long and paid the ultimate price for it. In 56, a lot of them, once the Soviets invaded, decided, we're not going to make that mistake again, and they left. And this country welcomed tens of thousands of Hungarians to our shores. How did your family decide it was time to leave rather than stick it out?
So in Budapest during the revolution, I mean, there were a lot of demonstrations. There was a lot of stuff happening in the streets. And, again, my parents were young people. They were 30 and 24. And, like young people, they were curious and they wandered around. And at one point they saw a guy being lynched, and the crowd was yelling, kill the communist, kill the Jew, interchangeably. And the reason for that is because there were a lot of Jews who were very senior in the Communist Party. And by 1956, the Communist Party in Hungary was much loathed. It was it was a very harsh Stalinist government, and people wanted to get rid of them. But my parents sort of saw that and they thought, okay, this could become ugly, and so they joined many people who decided to just get out. And the people who left Hungary were both Jews and Gentiles alike, right? There were a lot of people who experienced the Soviet invasion of Budapest in 1956, and the shelling and the violence that went with that, and they said, we want to go somewhere where there's peace, and not live through this again. And that's what they did. And they made this decision in days. And it astonishes me how quickly they decided to uproot themselves.
Did they find what they were looking for in Canada?
Absolutely. And I think that, so I should say that they're accidental Canadians. They wanted to emigrate to the United States. And when they got to Vienna, they found that there was a very long lineup outside the American embassy, and they had cloth coats on, and it was very cold. And somebody said, well, in the Canadian embassy, you can wait inside. And so that's why they became Canadians. And, but, they were proud Canadians, and they were happy to live here. And, they were very fortunate because Canada at that point was welcoming to these refugees. There were all sorts of amazing things that were happening, to the people who were coming here. And, within a couple of days when they arrived, they were sort of adopted by a Hungarian couple who'd been here already, and helped set them up, and they got jobs and internships and so on. So they were very, very fortunate,
and had a couple of kids.
And I feel very fortunate to have been born in Canada, to be born in Toronto. It's a welcoming society, and I hope that it's still a welcoming society, and because there are other people who need to find refuge in the way that the Hungarians did in 1956.
John, I'm going to ask you one last question, which is, for the longest time, I think exclusively what I read of yours was about urban affairs and urban politics, and you were very focused on that. And with a previous book, The Ward, and now with this book, No Jews Live Here, you're writing about stuff that is fairly new to you in terms of the breadth of your career.
Right.
Are you reclaiming your Jewish heritage?
Well, to some extent, and I'm trying to kind of connect it to things in my life at the moment and, in my career. And I'm not a practicing Jew. One of my sons had a b'nai mitzvah in a very secular setting. We identify as Jewish, but we also do Christmas. But the history of it is, I think, important to know and to be, to not have as a secret. And to me, it's also connected to something else I do professionally, which is write about cities, because, my parents were really urban people, and all the people that I grew up with were very urban. And so I think that there's a sort of a synchronicity there between the urbanness and, the content of this book.
No Jews Live Here. This is John Lorinc's memoir, and we are delighted that it has brought him to TVO tonight. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Steve.
There are plenty of very vulnerable people living in Ontario, and tonight we're going to look at some of the people who are possibly at the very bottom of the food chain. They are homeless, they are dying, and for the vast majority of them, they have nowhere to go, which is why the Journey Home Hospice exists. It's a small home in downtown Toronto that tries to make the last days on Earth for a handful of homeless people a little bit more civilized. SE Health helps run Journey Home, and their Chief Operating Officer, Nancy Lefebvre, is here to tell us more. Nancy, it's good to meet you.
Great. It's nice to meet you, too.
Welcome
Thank
to TVO.
you.
I got to do a
Thank
full
you.
disclosure thing off the top here. My wife is a health policy consultant. I think you know her.
I do.
She has done work for SE Health in the past, and so we
certainly
put that
has.
on the record
All right.
in the interest of full disclosure.
Thank you so much.
When did Journey Home Hospice start operations?
Yeah, so we started operations back in 2018, actually.
Is that just in Toronto?
Just in Toronto. And we started off with 4 beds. Wanted to kind of test it out, see what we needed to learn from establishing the hospice. And then in 2020, we expanded to 10 beds. And then 3 years later, we expanded to another 3 beds, so 13 beds. And more recently, we actually established a satellite site down in Windsor.
How many beds there?
Just 3 beds there.
3 beds
yeah,
there.
3 beds there, yeah.
So 16 altogether.
Yes.
My hunch is you need a lot more than that
We
to
do
get the
need
job
a lot
done.
more, yeah.
Let's talk about the job. Why is it necessary that you do what you do?
Well, first of all, there's about 7,000 people on the streets at any point in time in downtown Toronto alone, right? And, you may not think of it, but when you walk by them and you see them and not realizing some of them are very sick and ill and are at their end of life, have palliative care diagnosis, there's really very few places for them to go to die because they don't have a home. That's why they're on the streets. And so they can go to the hospital, but they're not comfortable in the hospital. Their street family is often not involved in visiting in there. So we've established a specialized hospice is really what it is, a specialized hospice place for them to go, that they're well taken care of, they're respected, there's no judgment. Often these individuals have mental health and addictions issues as well too, so we have specialized services within that. So
The assumption is that your clientele are pretty much all middle-aged to older white men. Is that the case?
no, not really. No. We have quite a wide variety. We do have younger in the teens. One of our first actually patients was a young girl that died at the hospice, right up to elderly, 60, 65 years old. Not elderly, 60, 65 years old. People who live on the street die at a much younger age than people who are not living on the street, probably half the age. I would say most of them die around 40 years of age. 42 years of age is their lifespan, so it's quite short.
If you are homeless right now, and if you are at or towards the end of your life,
Yeah.
maybe you've got an incurable disease, maybe, who knows, whatever you've got, what are your options today?
Well, your options are to continue living on the street, and many do choose to continue to live on the street. They can also go to the hospital, or as I say, we have this specialized service now in Toronto for them to live by. Actually, it's interesting, some individuals do come into the home and then decide that they don't want to live in the space. They want to live on the street with their street family. So what they might do is leave their medications at our home so that they can come in and get their meds so that there's no issues with any theft or anything like that while they're on the street. So
Why would a homeless person facing imminent death not want to die in a hospital?
Well, I think that there's a different type of approach to care within a hospital, and these individuals have very specialized needs. They often come from traumatic backgrounds and histories. They are often in the midst of taking drugs and narcotics and so on and so forth. And so when they go into the hospital, you're in a whole different kind of world. I think in our hospice, we really provide specialized care that's driven by the patient in terms of what they want to do. We have a managed alcohol program. We have a managed drug program, so that the idea is eventually that we move them into prescription medications that they can use to manage their pain and get them off the street drugs that they were using while they were out on the street.
Now that's interesting, because if somebody's dying, why do you care about whether or not they get off the drugs they're on?
You don't really care if they get off the drugs, but it makes the pain more manageable. So they're using street drugs for managing their pain, where we're using prescriptive drugs that are a bit more manageable. But in terms of things such as cannabis and alcohol, we're never going to, we have it available. We serve, we help them get through that. And what's interesting actually is many find they first come in and they taper themselves off because they're pain-free, they're comfortable, getting 3 square meals a day, lots of TLC from our volunteers.
Do your clients typically have nobody else in their lives who can advocate for them?
Yes, that's a good case. Typically, it is the case. Now, I must say, some of the work that we do is to help find families or help locate families. If the individual so chooses that, there have been opportunities where we have brought families back together or loved ones together or friends of theirs that they haven't seen for a long time and do that. But typically, they are quite alone. And it's just their street family who are their family.
Yeah.
So
I don't know if this is even possible to answer, but
Yeah.
what are they typically dying of when they come to you?
yeah, any type of cancer, just like the regular population. That's predominantly what they are. Some of the elder ones have more of a chronic diseases, congestive heart failure, chronic lung failure, those types of things. But predominantly, it's a cancer-related illness.
And how long are they typically with you?
So they are with us for 3 months, usually, typically, which is interesting because typically in hospices, people stay for about 12 to 14 days before they pass on. But what we find in the hospice here, they come into the hospice, they get, good care, good food, they're put on proper medications to manage their pain, and they start to feel better and they start to rebound to a certain degree. They're still on an end-of-life trajectory, but they do tend to get better. So their length of stay is longer in our hospice.
Do you have a clue as to what kind of demand there actually is out there for this kind of thing?
Well, we're full and we have a waiting list, so I would say there's a pretty high demand.
How many names on the waiting list?
How many names on the waiting list? That I'm not sure of, but that you even have a waiting list to, get into a place where you're going to carry out the end of your life and the rest of the days. So says something, I think, about the need. One of the things that we did do is because we've also noticed, as I said, that people get better when they come into the hospice for a period of time. We opened another 3 beds on another floor within the building. We partnered with Homes First and used renovated space within their facility. And what happens is that when people get better, instead of discharging them to the street or sending them back out onto the street where they're certainly deteriorate, we have what you might think is like a step down area where we move them down to the floor where they're much more independent. They don't require care, and either help them find housing, or if they do deteriorate, then we move them back up to the floor where the hospice services are provided. So
let's take a look at what you folks do.
All right.
Sheldon, if you would, a clip, please.
I'm here because I'm dying from cancer. I've run a pretty hardcore life, to run in the streets. I'm not caring about anybody or anything but myself.
I have been a nurse for many, many years, and I've just seen the phenomenal need that people have at the end of life care. And so when we think about people who are living on the street, when most people want to die at home, if you don't have a home, where do you go to die? And so what should we as a society be doing for them? And I think that's one thing here at Journey Home Hospice. We're trying to tackle 2 really tough societal issues, right? Nobody likes to talk about dying, and nobody likes to deal with the issue of homelessness.
The people that you are taking care of, how do I put this? You're trying to get additional resources for people who are, as we suggested in the intro, really at the bottom of people's priority list. These are homeless people, number 1, and these are people who are going to die imminently, number 2.
Yeah.
How do you get people to care about that population?
Well, that's a very interesting question because you're right. They're very 2 significant societal issues, right? Nobody knows what to do for the homeless population, and nobody likes to talk about end-of-life care. So, how our approach is that everybody is going to die, and everybody can relate to having family members or people die. And I think how we get to people to connect with it is that nobody really wants to die alone, and certainly nobody wants to die on the street. And homeless issue is such a large issue. We hope that we're shining a light on just a part of it to have people understand it and to give it a humane element. Because, the patients that we serve and the people that we have in our homes, they don't start out being homeless. They often have a lot of trauma and significant life circumstances that happen to them that lead them to being homeless.
Does this kind of service that you offer, this presumably is a model for any jurisdiction that wanted to do it.
Yes.
Does it exist elsewhere?
So the only other hospice that I'm aware of for the homeless population is in Ottawa. And it was started, there was a mission in Ottawa, a mission house for men in Ottawa, and they expanded into then providing end-of-life care services there. So that is really, to be honest with you, where I got the idea from. And after I went to visit them, I came back to our organization, St. Elizabeth Healthcare, and said, I think this is what we should do. And they said, we absolutely agree with you, like, make it happen. So.
You are in an emotional business.
Yes.
And we're going to show some of that as well. Sheldon,
Yes.
clip if you please.
One patient, I went into his room and the nurse was busy, and when she came in, she said, "Oh, he's dying." And I'm like, "No." She said, "Yes." And we moved him onto the bed. 5 minutes later, he was gone. And I felt bad because I didn't know. I didn't know. I didn't know this had.
Yeah.
How difficult a business is it to be in when you know that everybody you are serving sooner or later, and probably sooner, is going out the door in a casket?
Yeah. You know, it's a calling. It takes a special person to work in a hospice and a certain dedication to that, but even more so with this population. And what we've learned over the years of running a hospice is that finding the right people to work there, finding people that are dedicated to the cause, that are non-judgmental, that are open, and like this staff person of ours that just wants to be there to hold people's hands and care for them and make sure that they have the best end-of-life journey that they possibly can.
What kind of staff do you have?
So we have nurses, we have occupational therapists, we have personal support workers, and we have a phenomenal group of volunteers. And really, I have to say, if it wasn't for the volunteers, it would be very difficult to run the place as well as we do, because they provide a lot of companionship. They may be sitting reading a book, listening to stories, watching a movie, sharing music interests, taking them for a walk if they're that healthy to be able to go outside, or putting them in a wheelchair, taking them up to the balcony, the rooftop upstairs. They provide a lot of great care.
Do your clients ever get visitors?
Yes,
They do?
Yes, they do. They do. They have street family. And so we'd get all kinds of visitors. It's a very fun, interesting place. There's a lot of living going on there, actually, while people are dying, which makes it very unique.
Because I would think this clientele that you deal with would be particularly mistrustful of institutions in society, particularly in the healthcare system, which they've probably had some run-ins with over the years. How long does it take to sort of get them to relax and realize that they're among friends?
Yeah, it's a good point. It takes a little while. So when we first meet them, we meet them out in the community. When they are referred to us, we go to the community and meet them out in the community and have a conversation with them to see where they're at and if they're ready. And you're right, they are fearful of healthcare institutions, and so, or any institution for that matter. So we have come and visit it, just come and see what you think. See who's there, see how you feel. And sometimes they come in right away and they're fine. And then other times it takes them a little while longer till they have a comfort level. They may come back a few days to visit and see the people there, and eventually they move in. And it's usually a couple of weeks before they settle in to any kind of routine, or not so much of a routine, but they feel very comfortable. Like you saw the story of Peter. His story goes on to say what his experience was all about.
Who volunteers for this kind of work?
The best people. And I have to say, even during the pandemic, our volunteers continue to come to the hospice to work within the hospital. So people that are caring, that are kind, people that may have had experience with loved ones themselves, caring for them at home, or they may have individuals that they know that have lived on the streets themselves. So all kinds of people, from young to old, and everything in between.
So we know you got 16 beds right now.
Yes.
What's possible?
I think anything is possible. The challenge always is we do get partially funded by the government, which is fantastic, but we do have to fundraise for the rest of the operations, to pay our staff, to bring the food in, pay for rent, all those types of things, right? So for us, we're looking at a national expansion kind of program, and we may do that ourselves, or we may work in partnerships. What we're finding is that we've kind of become a bit of a center of excellence for people to come and learn about how to establish hospices for homeless, from people in the States to people from right across Canada. So we are very willing and happy to share our knowledge and our experience. And I must say that's one of the things I love about working in the hospice world. It's a very sharing community. And so we hope that we'll either expand by sharing that knowledge and helping others establish hospices, or look to establish them ourselves.
Well, I should say for the record here, even though SE Health was a client of my wife's, I didn't hear about you through her. I was on the subway one day, and one of your volunteers, Patrick McConkey, just walked up to me, introduced himself, and started to tell me about you. And that's where I first learned about it, and I thought, this sounds like a great story for our program.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing? And he's a great example of a volunteer that we have within the organization. He's very wonderful and very great with the individuals that live here. He makes a difference in people's lives every day.
I'll tell you what, he's a good salesman for you guys.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, I'll tell you that. Thanks so much for coming in.
Yeah.
This was really from SE Health, the Chief Operating Officer, Nancy Lefebvre. Thanks so much, Nancy.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
I think with working with metal, it's like painting, but painting in the 3D. So I get to take whatever's in my head and kind of just like make it alive. If I was talking to somebody who wanted to get into working with metal, I would tell them, go buy some copper, go buy some metal, and start learning how these metals work. Just jump right in. There's no right or wrong way, honestly.
There's a usefulness in being a novice. Anyone coming to a material without a deep background ends up experimenting with it in ways that maybe more classically trained people haven't thought of. My name is Melissa Bleeker, and we're here at the OCAD University Metal Shop, and I'm here to talk about my peer mentorship program with Scylla at Project Humanity.
My name is Priscilla, or Scylla's fine. Today we're here to talk about my mentorship with Melissa at OCAD.
Hi, I'm Dan Chapman-Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of Project Humanity. We developed PH 1-to-1.
With Project Humanity, it's mentorship between mentee and mentor, and they basically pair you up with a mentor in your artist practice.
Youth tell us what art form they're interested in pursuing, and we pair them with a professional working artist in that art form.
And I was like, this is really cool. I think it would be helpful for me to find somebody who works in the metal industry on a larger scale.
Project Humanity reached out to me in the studio here to facilitate this mentorship program, and it's been a really great experience, working in the studio and kind of like sharing and passing on that kind of knowledge base that I've acquired through my relationships with other mentors. And so to be a part of that kind of chain of information is nice.
One of the amazing things about this program is that it is highly adaptable, so that artists can co-create goals and different pursuits based on the specific needs of that youth.
I can't afford to go to school, so this has been great. Also the flexibility, because I am disabled, sometimes I have to cancel. I need to take time. So just being able to be like, I need to take a few days or a few weeks and then come back to it has been really helpful. And then also with how I like to learn, I kind of like to jump into things. So just having Melissa as a teacher has been great. Like, they're just ready to go. They're just like, yeah, whatever you want to do, we're going to do it.
Sometimes there's a strong element of just being a support person and showing up once a week. And it's really incredible to see the depth of relationships that can form in these partnerships.
It's nice to be able to see through someone else's eyes when they're first encountering material. The points that really surprised me were how quickly Scylla picked up many of the processes. I was looking at their welding ability, and I was a little jealous. My route to metalworking came through a studio art undergraduate program. I found myself drawn to the metal shop. It made a lot of sense to be drawn to metal, given my family history with steelworking, growing up listening to stories of my grandfather working in the steel mill. I ended up taking a program at Humber for welding techniques, and that led me into some time in the industry working as a metal fabricator and a welder.
I do like the fact that copper does require a little more maintenance, only because this way I'm able to cherish my pieces more. I'm taking time to clean them. I start sketching things out. I like to take inspiration from my African roots. This way I'm able to connect with the stories and folk tales and the things that I have learned and be able to kind of piece together history and where I've come from and my background. With that being said, I also want to be intentional with how I do speak on history. Because of slavery and colonization, history isn't always told properly. I also like to not always follow the rules because I think that is really fun when it comes to creating. Even though there are particular steps that you must follow, I still try to break those rules.
For me, something I think about a lot is the apparent permanence of metal. It's something we think of as like rigid, unyielding, something that doesn't change much. And with this permanence, you kind of end up with its counterpart. Because of its value as a material, it often gets reworked, melting down, tempering, all these ways that you can renegotiate the material's form. It's very forgiving.
I've been in shops before, but I haven't been in like a metal shop like this with this much equipment. Like the plasma cutter, like I had no idea about that before. So there was a lot of like new things. I started with research and kind of like self-taught myself how to make jewelry and work on a smaller scale with metal. I've been using like YouTube, just like research. I have joined a lot of Facebook groups in the metal community, which has been beyond helpful. There's so much knowledge on there.
The artist can be a really incredible gateway and access point for youth to connect to other artistic opportunities and communities that are related to their own interests.
These spaces are not, are typically male-dominated, not always accommodating or inviting to other kinds of people. That is definitely, I think, a failure of many kind of trade environments. Working as a welder or applying to metal fabrication jobs in industry, I've been told, you know, this is a man's job. You can't participate in this work.
Even right now, it's hard to find a space where I can work, like even just like ventilation, like somewhere I can work out of.
I'm hoping that the more visibility there is and the more people who are getting into these spaces and who are different and are kind of approaching things differently, just having those people there to be able to guide other people to come in. When you see someone in that role, you kind of can picture yourself in it.
I would say the biggest things that have been a barrier for me is just dealing with chronic pain and being disabled. So that's been a little frustrating. I should be producing, I should be working, I should be like, it's always that in my head. Even with just being dyslexic, like sometimes I got it and then sometimes I completely don't. Measurements, words, things like that, even just like grasping information sometimes. I kind of learned to kind of cope and adapt with it. I have a digital ruler and like most of my things are digital, so measuring. So that's very helpful. Also, just like taking some time for myself to reflect on like what was said to me, like even just making notes on that. After sessions, I'll like record stuff on my phone to like kind of like put that information into my own words so that I can understand it and come back to it. Kind of making an archive for myself.
People who have a good sense of the material, you can see it in the way that they move. There's kind of like almost a gentleness that happens. When you're metalworking, I think a lot of people are under the assumption that you're kind of brute force hitting things into place, but it's actually a very like delicate process. And so when you can mirror people's movements and you can watch kind of like the accents that they're taking as they're moving material in a certain direction, to be able to visually respond to that and imitate it in real time, more so just focusing on gestures as opposed to language, especially in like a one-on-one setting, being able to kind of fine-tune even your slight movements that you're making when you're working with material, to have that like immediate feedback, you can move forward so much more quickly.
Where I mostly like to grab inspiration from is water. There's always something happening in the water, especially live water. Once I finish a piece every time, I'm always just like, okay, I did that. I can't believe that it all worked out, and sometimes things don't work out and I have to pivot, and then I end up creating something I didn't even think I was going to create.
I was interested in kind of hand forming this encasement around the outside through kind of patchwork. I really like how the pinch points here from the heat kind of buckle the surface. It feels very bodily to me. I really enjoy holding it. And then within the center, I have these everyday objects cast in iron. As I was layering the beeswax, and as those were building up, these layers, it began to kind of obscure the pieces underneath it. To me, that kind of echoed this idea of memory. It's kind of amazing to see the movement of something that appears so rigid and immovable, and then seeing where my own hand can influence it. I'm pointing to something that lasts outside of maybe a human time frame.
I'm a big dreamer. I love dreaming and I love making things happen. I would like to see my work on runways. I would like to install some work on the street, galleries, exhibit worldwide. Like, I want to be able to travel and bring my work with me, collaborating with other people, meeting different communities, and how other people work with metal, I think would be really cool. I think that would be amazing.
If I could say something to my younger self, I would probably emphasize the importance of persisting and just keep with a daily practice and carve out that space when it's possible.
I would tell myself, do not put a limit on yourself and do not think that you can't do something.
Be okay with having no experience.
Do not think too hard about your equipment and do not think too hard about what your setup is like. Just start.
Be okay with the learning process.
Don't get too in your head. Give yourself some grace as well, because you will make mistakes and it will get frustrating. But the best thing is to just jump in and get to know what you're working with.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, December 12th, 2024. Tomorrow on the program, John Michael McGrath and yours truly will mount our final edition of the On Poly podcast for 2024. We'll hit the big issues of the week and answer your questions in a big mailbag edition. Hope you'll join us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.